If you ever run a Google search for button or internet button, you might likely come up with something kind of like this. So I'm going to show you how to create an object like this, but using some of our new selection tools and functions and introducing a few new ones like modifying a transformation, or modifying a selection, or using rulers and guides to make sure that you're creating to a specific size. Begin this exercise by making a new file and setting it to 5 by 5 inches, 72 dpi, and RGB for the color mode, and click OK. And then hit Command 0 to make this fill your screen. First thing I want to do is measure off the area that I'll be using because I specifically want to make a button that is 3 inches wide by 1.5 inches tall. But you'll notice here on my original, I've got a bit of a drop shadow around it that will go outside of that size that I just said, which is why I've created a bigger canvas than I actually need. To measure off an area, you need to get your rulers, and those are under View and Rulers, or Command R. And now you've got a ruler at the top and the side of your document. You can change the measurements on these by right-clicking and choosing one of the drop-down options. I'm going to work in inches. Then to create a guide, click on the ruler on the left and drag out a line and line it up with inch number 1, and then do the same from the top and again line it up with inch number 1. For my other two guides that I need to place on the exact measurement, I could count over 1, 2, 3 and place a guide here on 4, but there are some documents that you get into complicated measurements with, and I'm going to show you a trick that's really helpful for making sure you've got the right size. Photoshop works with what's called a 0 point, and the default 0 point is at the top left corner of a document. You can see that's where the 0 measurement is, both for the top and side rulers. I can change where the 0 measurement is by clicking here in the top left where those two rulers combine, and then dragging out this X until I am over that intersection where I placed my first guides and let go. Now you'll notice the 0 point is right in line with my guides, or where I dropped that 0 point. So now it's easy for me to grab another guide and just come out to my 3-inch mark and another guide and down to my 1.25 inch mark. Pretty spiffy. To restore a 0 point, you can double click on this little top corner where you first got it, and now it'll be back to default. Let's create the main shape that we're going to use for this button by grabbing your rectangular marquee tool, and then start on this top left intersection, click and drag down to the bottom right intersection, and let go. You do want to make sure your marquee is set to 0 feather, so if by chance you were feathered, undo and set it to feather and redo it again. Next, we're going to grab the elliptical marquee tool and make sure again that the feather is set to 0. An anti-aliasing option is on. I'm going to show you the intersect function, which I mentioned before but didn't really use. You can have intersect by either clicking this button or holding down the short keys Option and Shift, which is what I'm going to do. When you have the little X by your marquee, that means you're set to intersect, so you can click and begin dragging an oval. Now you notice I clicked really high for this oval, so while I've still got my button pushed down, I'm going to also hold down the space bar, which will let me move that around. Now if that's really too many keys for you to keep track of, go ahead and push the button to get this intersect function. And then when I let go of my space bar, I can continue resizing. So I'm going to shape off my button so that it's got kind of a gently rounded edge, and make sure that those corners are roughly equal when I let go. And now I only have where those two were overlapping left. This is what I want to be my main base shape, so I'm going to create a new layer and then grab a color to fill this shape up. I can fill by hitting Option Delete, which is an awesome shortcut to know. And now we're ready to create a highlight. So let's hit the New Layer button and name it highlight. Okay, so here's your first trick on modifying an existing selection. So here we have a selection made, and I want it to be smaller than this. In fact, I'm going for something kind of this shape. But because I want it to have the same sort of curve that my outside edges have, it's useful to start with the actual selection of my base shape. So you can transform a selection without changing the pixels of the layer it's on by going to Select and choosing Transform Selection. And you can drag those corners in, or even hold Option to drag the sides in at the same time. So I'm going to drag these in, about here-ish, and then hit Enter to finalize that selection. Right now, if I filled this with color, I would actually have really hard edges on both the top and the bottom. But if I look at my example, I can see that it's got a soft edge at the top and an even softer edge at the bottom. So I am going to grab my rectangular marquee and set feather to, let's start with 10. And I'm going to take away from the bottom so that it will feather the way I want it. Hold down Option, click and drag till you're overlapping part of that bottom, and let go. Let's see what this looks like. Let's fill this up with white. I'm going to grab white and click OK, and then fill is Option Delete, and I'm going to deselect. So you can see here I've got a nice feathered edge, which is great, but I also have a really hard edge up here. So I'm going to set my feather down maybe a little smaller, like 6-ish, and then click and drag to create a selection. And now when I hit delete, it'll start taking away, and I can even hit delete a couple of times if I want to really take away. Now you might need to play around with how much feathering gets the result that you like, but that's definitely an option. Here on the bottom I've got a solid edge that I also want to get rid of, so I'm going to select around that and hit delete again. Once you have a highlight built, it's good to sometimes just lower the opacity just a little bit. Okay, so let's go back and look at the example for a second. The other thing our example has is some brighter and darker areas. With a glassy object, anytime there's light coming from one direction, in this case it's coming from the top, it would pass through a glassy object and bounce against the opposite side. So this is actually a bounce reflection, and having that reflection in there will help this feel a lot more 3D than it would otherwise. So let's make that selection. I'm going to do that by taking this tool and setting it to 10 pixels, and then just creating a rectangular section and making a new layer and filling it with white and deselecting. Now you can tell this is much bigger than I need, so I'm going to transform it down to the size that I want by hitting Command T and then moving these in and moving it until it looks right to me. Sometimes when doing these, it's really useful to have a very specific example that you're trying to match. I'm going to hit Enter. So there's a highlight. The other thing our example has is actually some darker blues in there. So to do that, let's go to our original layer and create a gradient that will fill it with darker blue. But first off, I need to make that selection so that that gradient doesn't fill up the whole screen. I can choose just this object that's on the layer by holding down Command until I get the little marquee and then clicking on the thumbnail, which will create an exact selection around my object. So I'm going to grab my gradient tool and I'm going to set it so that it's the foreground to background square. Click OK and make sure that my options are set to, first off, let's do a reflected gradient, and that reverse is turned off and opacity is up at 100. Next, let's grab some color. So I'm going to click on my color picker, and the first color I'll grab is the background. But then my background color, if I click on that and also click on that blue, then I can drag this down into the much darker blues and click OK. So now I'm going to create a gradient on this layer by clicking and dragging down, and I can hold down Shift to make sure that's a straight line. Alright, so that isn't quite what I wanted. I'm going to just keep doing this until it ends up closer to what I want. And it looks like from where I'm dragging, it'll create bright blue out to where I end dragging. So that's a little more it. I've got some dark down here and some dark up here. And I think we're done with that selection, so hit Command D. We're getting really close, you guys. So one thing we need to do is soften down this highlight. I'm going to show you a really cool trick for reflection highlights. If you click on that layer to make it active, and then go to the blend mode, which is this drop down in the layers panel, and set it to overlay, you'll notice as long as that color was white that you made the highlight with, it will become a more intense version of the blue that's behind there, or the color that's behind there. So let's make a base for this object. I actually want to have a kind of an outline like in my example. It looks like this blue is sitting down in something. To do that, with another modification, you will hold Command and select the base so that you have that same shape selected, and then go to the Select menu, Modify, and Expand. We can set Expand. Let's try 5 and see how that looks. It's a little big. I'm going to hit Command Z and try that again. So Select, Modify, Expand, and this time I'm only going to do it by 3. That looks pretty good. So creating a new layer, and then I'm going to choose a really dark gray and fill this by hitting Option Delete. Now you'll notice I completely covered up everything, so I'm going to grab this top layer and drag it down below my base layer. And now you can see it gives me a bit of an outline around it. Now that I've crossed my guidelines, they're kind of getting in the way, so I want to hide those. I'm going to go up to View and choose, let's see, I know it's in here somewhere, Show, and then Guides, where you can hit Command:, and that will hide your guides. The last thing I want to do with this is to add a really small highlight around that edge, and I'll show you why. If I click on my background and hit Command-I, it will inverse it to be perfectly black. The gray that is the base of this now is nice that it's gray, but it could have one more little detail that will make it stand out and feel really 3D. So just follow along with this. I'm going to select this layer by hitting Command-click on that thumbnail. Go to Select, Modify, and choose Border. And while we're here, notice that there's some other options that you can come in and play with to find out what they do. And then let's enter in 2 pixels and click OK. So now I'm going to zoom in quite a bit here. Maybe not quite that much. Get to where my pixel grid isn't showing. Now you can see instead of having one selection, I actually have this double selection line, which means that only the area inside of there is selected. And I'm going to grab my gradient tool and set these to default by clicking on the little black and white squares at the top of these colors. And also let's choose linear, which is this first gradation option. And then I'm going to click up here and drag down and see what happens. Alrighty, so that made my bottom one really white. That's kind of not quite what I intended. Hit Command-Z. Let's change this black to a medium gray and try the same thing again. Whoa, that went red. I meant to do gray. Medium gray. So I'm going to click here at the top and drag down. And then I can either deselect or just hit Command-H to hide my marching ants. This is a way that you can hide the marching ants so that they don't interfere with what you're looking at without actually getting rid of them. The first time you do it, you will get this pop-up. What you want to choose is Hide Extras. And here's our button. We still actually have that selection made, and to show you that's the case, I'm going to just grab a random color and hit Option Delete to fill that. So that selection hasn't gone away, and if I hit Command H, it will show again. So now I'm just going to hit Command D to get rid of it. We are so close to having a button finished. Let's change the background back to white. So click on the layer and let's this time select all. So you can go File, Select All, or Command A, and then set your default, and then click Switch to get white, and Option Delete to fill and deselect. Now I could show you how to create a drop shadow with a feathered marquee that we've adjusted and everything, but let's just show you the really quick way to do a drop shadow, which is double clicking on this part of the layer and then clicking on the word drop shadow down here. You want to click on the word and not just the check mark so that you get the options to adjust that. And you can play around with these to see what they do. Typically I don't leave it at the default. I'll change some things like the size. One of the things that you would want to change with something like this is indicating where the light is coming from, and right now that light really looks like it's coming from straight above. And then click OK. Alrighty, there is our button. Now I don't need all of this in the file. This is quite a bit of excess. So if I turn the background layer off, so all I see are the transparent pixels, I can go to Image, Trim, and choose Transparent Pixels and click OK, and there's my button. If you wanted to, you could add type. Now I typed it and it's below some layers, so I'm going to move this up to the top, and then Command T to transform and make it bigger. And you know what, just to make it cool, I'm also going to double click on this one and add a drop shadow and click OK. So the button is ready to save. Well, like with everything, I save a working file. So I would first save my Photoshop file, which would be my working file, and then I would save the file I'm going to upload to the internet. And kind of the two that you do for that are either a JPEG, which does not have a transparent background, or a PNG, which does. So let's go File, Save As, and change the format to PNG. That will keep none of the layers. It'll just be on one layer, but it will also preserve that transparency. And then hit Save. This will pretty much always open, so I want to have pretty much, I think, the smallest, slow, and interlace none checked all the time. I've really not had any instances where I needed to do otherwise, and then click OK. Alright, so I know that was kind of a long example, but I hope that brought home a little more of how to use some of those basic selection tools.